We encourage you to engage and ask questions throughout the session by including them in the chat feature. Your input is really invaluable to us, so please don't forget to complete the feedback form at the end of the webinar so that we can improve future webinars. Thank you very much for being here, and I hope you enjoy the session. Now, I'd like to begin with a very quick overview about ULEC. So the Ukrainian Language Education Centre is located at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Alberta. We have three priority, or CIUS had three priority areas, mainly research and support for Ukraine, Ukrainian Canadians and Canada-Ukraine relations, and Ukrainian language education. So ULEC occupies 1/3 of its mandate. Our particular mandate is more precise, and we have 4 areas that we work in: to advocate for Ukrainian language education across all jurisdictions. I think someone might not have their mics muted, so may I ask you all to mute your mics? Thanks. So the ULEC mandate, 1, to advocate for Ukrainian language education across all jurisdictions. 2, to develop or support the development of learning resources for teachers and students. 3, to provide professional learning for teachers. And 4, to engage in research relating to language education. We're always happy to receive donations, and Maria will put in the chat a little later how you can do so. Now, I have the pleasure of introducing our webinar speaker today, Dr. Mark Pijak. Mark completed his PhD at Stanford University and is a multifaceted scholar with expertise in data analysis, digital humanities, and ancient history. Since 2024, he has been a key figure at the Getty Research Institute in Los Angeles, contributing to pivotal projects such as the Getty Vocabularies Project and the Provenance Index. The Getty Institute, renowned for its vast research library of over 800,000 holdings, is dedicated to art and visual culture and provides Mark with a very rich environment for his work. His work spans linked open data, data visualization, and online publication. As co-director of the Greek Coin Finds of Ukraine project, he leads an international effort to digitize and map coin finds across modern Ukraine, enhancing our understanding of the region's historical narratives. Dr. Pijak's scholarly outputs include forthcoming contributions to the Journal of Economic Literature and the edited volume, War in the Ancient World. His diverse interests also extend to sports, with publications like his analysis of Austin Matthews in The Athletic. Since 2020, he began a project with ULEC overseeing its history over almost 5 decades. His approach is unique, situating ULEC's history amidst the issues of its times. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mark Pijak.
That this project really has involved a lot of hands. I'll just mention a few, but I am leaving a lot of people out, so I'm sorry for that. Thanks, Mauricio Patrician and Bisco. I had a lot of conversations with those 3 people, as well as Roman Patrician in sort of 2019, 2020, and they were key elements in putting together this history. I want to preface this talk, workshop, lecture with a basic caveat that I think that there will be many people in this audience who will just know more about the basic facts of this, having lived through it, than I will. If I make mistakes, I'm going to invite you to correct me via email at the end of this talk. I'll provide an email that you can send any corrections to. Feel free to ask questions, probably in the chat at first, but I'll pause periodically to take questions from the audience over the course of this talk. Okay, I'm going to start sharing my screen, and if someone can't see something or if it's unclear, please shout that out to me, and
Good.
I'll try to fix it.
All good.
All right. So I have two goals with this talk, and I'm sorry for the picture of Don Getty. This picture lives in my head. I can't get rid of it. This is a picture of him celebrating. I think it's a Grey Cup with the Eskimos in the mid 1950s. And if we could say that any person achieved two goals, the man won a Grey Cup and he served as premier of the province. So, and you're going to see this photo again in the course of this talk. So what are my goals in this talk? I would boil them down to two. I want to either introduce or reintroduce a forthcoming history of ULEC that I have been writing for some time, which Alenka reminded me of at the start of this talk. It is long in the works, and there are various reasons for that, but I think it will be worth it in the end. The second is to introduce, discuss, take questions about, argue over perhaps some of the theoretical lenses that I used in writing that history. So I'll be talking in particular about a theory that William Sewell Jr. Basically developed in the 1990s, expounded on in the 2000s. It's a theory of structure, and really he says structuration, but we don't need to worry about those specific details. And I want to talk about the ways in which that helped to inform this history. I'll say right off the bat that if you read the history, there really isn't a point in it that I specifically bring in Sewell or any of the topics that I'll be talking about. I did sort of write this up as a separate sort of appendix chapter where I talk about some of my theoretical frameworks. But a lot of this I put into use. And one of the, I think, benefits of this talk is that you're going to maybe get a little bit of background on how these things explicitly work in terms of how theory and history kind of intersect with one another. So those are two goals. And then just in terms of what the sort of actual plan is, I'm going to start with the sort of 30,000 foot view of the ULEC history, what I've been working on, some of the basic strategies, and some of what the process was, a little bit of the timeline. I will transition into a second part of the talk, which will be kind of this very basic overview of Sewell's theory of structure. That is the point where I will most encourage people to ask questions if anything comes up, because I want to make sure that that's clear to everyone. And then in the third part, I am going to talk through, and pretty quickly, 3 case studies that came up in the course of the history where I think this framework really applies. And I say quickly because I think each of these sections will take no more than 15 minutes. I'm trying to stay on target for about 45 to 50 minutes with some time for questions at the end as well. Okay, so we keep mentioning a history, and what are we talking about? In 2019, I was approached by Alenka with a proposal to do a comprehensive history of ULEC up to that point. There had been several, not attempts, I mean, successful attempts at this up to, within certain bounds up to that point. So there was something to work with there, but they were relatively narrow institutional histories that really kind of went up to a point and never went further than that. And so one of the things that I established early on is that I was interested in doing something more ambitious than that really contextualized ULEC in in terms of its time, in terms of a larger political setting, in terms of a lot of the factors that I felt that if you didn't talk about them, that you would be really not telling a full story. Um, this spiraled into something very large. So, in terms of our methodology, we interviewed more than 30 individuals. All of this was recorded and transcribed and took place within sort of social scientific guidelines that guarantee privacy and so forth. But in the end, I think what we wound up with was something that was fairly comprehensive in terms of the players who really had something to do with ULEC or with the places in which CIUS intersected with ULEC, certain aspects of the Ukrainian Bilingual Program, and so on, sort of leading up to 2020, 2021. We really didn't go any further than that, unfortunately. That meant that we really didn't talk about the effects of COVID on bilingual education. We didn't talk about the Russian invasion of Ukraine or any of the things that have come after that. To the extent that we talk about them, to the extent that I talk about them, it's sort of to say that, or to invite future analysis that really picks up where this will leave off. Okay, so I have been talking about this, but what is this? I mean, I would say, it's fairly long. It's a book-length history of ULEC. Chapter 1, and it sort of proceeds in roughly 10-year increments, but not necessarily. These things don't periodize completely cleanly. Chapter 1 covers the early history right after the foundation of CIUS, when ULEC was preceded by a sort of predecessor or sister organization, the Ukrainian Language Resource Centre, which had a more limited mandate, but really was instrumental in a lot of early outreach work, a lot of resource provision in the early years of the Ukrainian Bilingual Program. That goes up to 1986. Excuse me, when ULEC is funded and begins its actual work as that organization. Chapter 2 focuses on those early years leading up to essentially Ukrainian independence, which I took to be like a really major inflection point where a lot of the dynamics that shape Ukrainian diaspora life up to that point flip or at least diverge radically afterwards. Which means that chapter 3 is really spent in the 90s, talking about some of the changes in CIUS and ULEC's strategy for engaging with audiences, for finding funding, and so forth. This is especially true since there were fairly radical changes in how provincial education funding worked in that era. Chapter 4 covers ULEC in the 21st century, 2000 to 2013. 2013 is the cutoff largely because there are fairly radical institutional changes that happen at ULEC itself in that period. But that chapter really focuses on technology. It'll be part of one of the case studies that we talk about later in this lecture. And then chapter 5 focused on ULEC up to the present, which focused on that sort of post reform moment, the transition from Marussia Petrician's long stint as director into the period where Alla and Olenka took over, and how that transition was navigated. I will move on to okay, we're actually still good. So having kind of introduced that, I want to focus very briefly on the title of this talk, right? The structures of multiculturalism. In that title, I thought I was being a little cheeky, a little bit playful. I was referencing Manoly Lupul's memoir, The Politics of Multiculturalism, where he really gets into the history of the broad movement in multiculturalism in, I guess, Canada, with a focus in particular on Alberta, since he was a professor at the University of Alberta, first director of CIUS, was involved in the creation of CIUS. He traces the ups and downs, right? So he has chapters and sections that really detail the collapse of a consensus that existed around multiculturalism. Um, I especially read and reread his coverage of the 1996 repeal of the Alberta Multiculturalism Act. But the whole thing was really also instrumental for writing this history. If you didn't know, you can get a free copy of it digitally through the CIUS archive at the QR code that I've provided here. So feel free to do so. It is always worth the read. Obviously, here we have a beautiful, rather dapper looking photo of the man, probably, just judging by the collar and the styling, sometime in the mid to late 1970s. And I think maybe keeping Manoly Lupul in mind will be worthwhile as we talk about these structures and the role of structure and theories of structure, because one of the things that I'm at pains to emphasize in the course of this lecture is the ways in which individuals, through understanding social structures, political moments, the conjunction of different kinds of structures, can function as sort of a social entrepreneur, as an agent who is able to make real change. Now, Lupul is not the only person who we could mention in this regard in terms of the foundation of CIUS and so forth. But, at least with regard to ULEC, ULRC, early CIUS, this space of talking about second language education. I mean, he's really the person to forefront in this conversation. So that's who I've chosen to really talk about here. And I just want to actually look at a document that he was intimately involved in the creation of. This is something that I think many people, especially when I started this project, people were talking about the detailed proposal. And what this refers to is a 1976 document written by Lupul and sort of a cadre of other diaspora intellectuals, sort of political elites, that outlined the need for a research institution that would focus on Ukrainian scholarship. And this was approved in June of 1976. It forms the basis for CIUS as it exists today. By extension, it forms the basis for ULEC as it exists today. When we're talking again about social structures, about social norms, the sort of basic assumptions that we have about politics, about culture. It's interesting that it begins with language education. I think that this is something that has shifted around us over time. We now talk about language education in kind of fundamentally different ways, but this is sort of stuck in print forever in a way that we can return to and remind ourselves of why ULEC came about, why CIUS came about. The very first page starts with the inauguration of the Ukrainian Bilingual Program, of a grade 1 class entering the first cohort that would go through these various grades leading up to graduation within this public bilingual curriculum. Actually, Alenka would probably correct me on the terminology, but that's within this program, the program. Actually, I wanted to do everyone a favor because it was hard for me to get this document. I had to go to the archive, dig it up, scan it on my phone. But the QR code below will take you to a link on my Dropbox where I'm hosting it. I'll probably take it off in the next few days. But if you feel like grabbing a copy of this, it's there. I'm going to save you a trip to the archive. Go do it now. Let's get to the question of why theory, why theorize. It's a thing that I learned in grad school that, grad students like theory, certain professors like theory, but I think ordinary people, sane people, don't like social, political, academic theory. Even worse, I think, is structure, social structure, capital S structure. I think this invites like sort of pretentious um, philosophizing about the nature of society, but I think it is actually useful, and I'm going to make that argument here. For one thing, we use theory whether we like to or not. I had a professor in grad school basically say, you can pretend that you're a common sense historian who only talks about the facts, but whether you admit it or not, you are using a theory to present your facts. Facts don't exist on their own. And I'm going to just quickly quote E.H. Carr. Now, E.H. Carr might not be a favorite of everybody in the room. He has like the bad luck to have been wrong twice about very major world events. So he was like pro-German before World War II. He was pro-Soviet after World War II. But he has a way with words, and he talks about this idea of theory, of interpretation in history. I'm going to just quote him. According to the common sense historians, history consists of a corpus of ascertained facts. The facts are available to the historian in documents, inscriptions, and so on. Like fish on the fishmonger's slab, the historian collects them, takes them home, cooks them, and serves them in whatever style appeals to him. The facts are really not at all like fish on the fishmonger's slab. They are like fish swimming about in a vast and sometimes inaccessible ocean. What the historian catches will depend partly on chance, but mainly on what parts of the ocean he chooses to fish in, what tackle he uses, these two factors being, of course, determined by the kind of fish he wants to catch. By and large, the historian will get the kinds of facts he wants. History means interpretation, and as far as am concerned, interpretation means theory. And the thing that I would just say is that it's good to be explicit about these things. So I'm just going to very quickly, what, in my own words, rather than Sewell's, what do I think structure is? Broadly, I think the theories of structure focus on big social patterns, habits, constraints, rules, structuring frameworks that both prevent us from straying too far away from them. They tell us how to act, even if they do so silently. But they also enable us to work within them. So like law is a structure. The economy is structured, and it structures our lives. Rules of the road, rules of board games, romantic norms, forms of marriage, religion, culture, etc. Is everything a structure? I mean, kind of. Does that make it useless? I don't think so. So let's kind of get into why I don't think that's the case. So I'm going to focus on a guy named William Sewell Jr. Here's another QR code. If you want to take a look at his theory of structuration, he published it first in an article in a journal in the 1990s. He republished it in his 2005 book, Logics of History. JSTOR offers it. I think if you just register, you don't have to pay, but please let me know if you want me to, under the table, send you a copy after this talk. So he wants to take these sociological theories of structure, economy, politics, culture, psychology, something like Freud's theory of the mind and the soul. He wants to rework these big structural theories to make them useful to historians. So, and why is this? I mean, one of the big critiques of structure, Marxism, is that it presents history and it presents society as a machine that moves and reacts to itself. Structures react to other structures. There is this kind of accumulation or layering of different social norms or habits over time, but there's no real sense that individuals have any kind of effect over it, even though structures are made up of individuals. What he wants to do is to create an account that allows for change over time and that allows for individuals to fit into social systems that in a way that allows them to have some agency, to basically affect those systems in turn. So he would call this, I say, two-way relationship. He says a dual relationship to structure. And everything that I'm going to do in this section of the talk is to lay out some of these theoretical some very simple theoretical principles that you can kind of actually use in a lot of different historical or even contemporary situations. Before we move on, I just wonder if there are any questions before we keep going. Okay, and I will continue. Sewell talks over and over about structures being composed of two things: schemas and resources. So if you think of a structure, be it the economy, be it a legal system, within that structure, there are schemas that are rules, patterns, vocabularies, even grammars that abstractly create the it sounds stupid to say that they structure the structure, so I'm going to try not to say that, but they provide the rules by which things within that structure play out. Resources are the tools, things, currency, enabling instruments that allow us to act on these patterns, that either allow us to act effectively within them, or maybe, who knows, actually change them in some ways. Let's talk about, say, referees, right? The referee's rule book contains an abstract schema for how to officiate a game. That is the rules themselves, not even the text of the rules, because the text of the rules exists in a rule book, which is, I would say, a resource. The zebra striped shirt is a resource that the referee employs. It is a sign of their authority within a structural system. The whistle that they use to stop play or to start play, that is a kind of resource as well. The authority that is appointed or allowed to referees, that everybody agrees is part of their person, that they're imbued with at the time of the game, I would say that that is a resource. People are free to, obviously disagree about these things, about exactly where things fit into what we're talking about. But really, those are the three things that you need to remember to get Sewell: structures, schemas, resources. And then the question is what this cashes out for us. Where does this pay out for us in terms of understanding history? If we're talking about Sewell providing us with some tools to inject change back into history, to allow for individuals to have some say in larger historical processes, well, he provides some scenarios or some dynamics that basically allow for this to be a thinkable thing. Unlike, say, in, not, who knows? There are like a million brands of Marxism. There are a million brands of Freudian analysis, but most of them kind of push individuals to the side. Not Sewell, though. And he puts this in terms of a couple of different scenarios, right? So he talks about something called the multiplicity of structure. He points to the fact that some structures that we think of as unitary actually consist of either fragments or different streams or internal contradictions. He points to, say, the early or even the contemporary history of Christianity, right? I think that people talk about Christianity as one thing. And certainly, practitioners within Christianity do, because their own branch of Christianity is the correct one. So I don't want to belittle this to anyone in the audience who has strong feelings, but it is a descriptive fact that there have been disagreements about the nature of Christianity over time. One of the earliest was the disagreement between the Arians and the Homoousians. The Homoousians are the ones who believe that God is one essence and that Jesus, the Holy Spirit, and God existed at exactly the same time, always. The Arians are heretics because they think that God created Jesus. These are, arguments that are not even familiar to us anymore as Christians unless we're talking about it in a purely historical way. But they are tensions that existed, at least at one point, within Christianity, and that created tremendous changes at the level of the Roman Empire at the time, at a historical level that conditioned the development of the church. And, these ideas are created in the heads of individuals, right? today we have Catholics, Quakers, evangelicals, Lutherans, Calvinists, and on and on and on and on. CIUS, we could take this to a much smaller scale problem. CIUS is traditionally framed in terms of three pillars, right? Language, Ukrainian language education, Ukrainian Canadian studies, and sort of history broadly construed. And the balance of those within CIUS changes, sometimes clashes, sometimes is like entirely synergistic. So this is the way in which the multiplicity of structures can help explain the ways in which these institutions change over time, but then the ways in which individuals working within them have some bearing over what it actually is at stake and how this works. The second way that structures change is through what's called the transposability of schemas. So, I mean, this is where I think someone like Sewell gets a little bit painful for normal people who aren't really versed in academic jargon. But we can unpack this. I think it's fairly simple, right? So transposable means exportable, movable, reusable across a bunch of different contexts. This would mean that the schema, the set of rules that you use in one place, or the norms, the kind of agreements that you come to, the ideas that dominate in that space can be taken to other places and used. But when they are used in those other places, things work out differently. So one of the examples that I use in the book is accountability frameworks in the 80s and 90s. So this starts as something in Thatcher's Britain to kind of really to be uncharitable, to put the screws to public institutions, various kinds of administrative bodies, bureaucratic institutions in Britain. This comes to include educational institutions, partly because they are almost uniformly public in the UK, and that was a place where these could be applied. Those accountability practices, best practices, frameworks, the ideas around them, the values around them are exported to North America in the 90s and 2000s. I think we could see them at play in the modern university, at the University of Alberta. And the question is, how did they get there? That it is down to the fact that you can have rules in one place and then they can move. A third example is the unpredictability of resource accumulation. So we've talked about how schemas kind of work in creating instability. Resources do the same. So if you accumulate resources in one environment, in one context, under different circumstances, they could yield entirely different results in another place. Different resources can be claimed by different schemas or different structures. Consider this, right? My example would be you buy a plot of land with a lot of oil on it. That means different things if it's in Alberta in 1870 versus 1970. Like oil on land is not particularly, it's not valuable until, the 1910s, the 1920s. Quick pop quiz. What image are we looking at here, right? You could say, oh, maybe it's somewhere it's like in a Gulf state, maybe. But in fact, this is like 2 blocks from where I live in Los Angeles. This is Venice Beach in like 1935. And today it looks entirely different. There's a different balance of how resources come into play in that environment, basically almost a century apart. Okay, the polysemy of resources, once again, getting into academic jargon, but let's sort of unpack this. Polysemy means many meanings, multiple meanings, different meanings. Meaning, and I sort of just mentioned this, right? Resources mean different things. Or they mean different things in different schemas because the resources themselves kind of are the same, but they apply in different places. I am going to talk a little bit about the Royal Commission on Biculturalism and Bilingualism. It's interesting to note that this started as a French-English debate only. It's in the title. But by the end, moving from the Pearson era to the Pierre Elliott Trudeau era, it becomes a founding document for multiculturalism, which really involves these other groups other than the French and the English. And both the document itself and a lot of the conversations and the people involved in it, the social capital that was mobilized, those are all resources that are turned to other ends. I talked a little bit about this in my introduction. The intersection of structures, right? So structures, complexes of structures, groupings of structures, they touch on one another in ways that sometimes we don't acknowledge when we're talking about them in conversation, but we have to acknowledge when we actually look at them sort of in the round. And that interaction forces them to change over time. It forces kind of event level changes to emerge, or it forces long-term changes to emerge. So in professional sport, let's say, I think sports fanatics would be tempted to say that it's all about winning. And in fact, that's false. That is entirely false. We could talk about the economics of sports, but we could also talk about the politics of sports. We could, I would put forward maybe the 1972 Summit Series. It was a huge part of building Canadian identity, but it also exposed how bad the Canadians were at hockey. They barely eked out a victory there. The Soviet system was profoundly more sophisticated in terms of strategy and tactics, performance, overall capacity to win games, which they proved in 1981 at the Canada Cup. And then the obvious recent example is the trip that the U.S. men's team took to the White House. The ways in which this conditioned Austin Matthews being booed in Toronto a week later, it will probably result in him and Brady Tkachuk moving to the United States at some point in the next few years. It may cause changes in the Canadian national teal both the recruitment and various elements of like Hockey Canada's training program. So I'll leave it there. I think that I can rely on our good Canadian audience to sort of extrapolate from that. And I can move on to some case studies. I think we've covered Sewell, and I hope that everybody understood. If you did, then congratulations. You're in the academic club. You get social structure. But before we move on, I will take some questions because I'm not sure. Like, it is tough. I do understand that. Okay. It seems like we all understand structure, which is great news. I'm going to talk through some case studies that actually get into the history that I've written. I'm hoping that it will be available to everyone in some form relatively soon. You can check my facts. I think I probably will say some things that are somewhat inaccurate, and I would appreciate correction from possibly even some of the principals who took part in it. Case study number one, let's talk about the national level, multiculturalism and Ukrainian Canadians. I think many folks in the audience will be familiar with the Royal Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism, especially its fourth volume, which talked about groups other than the English and the French. The commission itself was formed in 1963 under the Pearson government. For the younger folks in the audience, that is Lester B. Pearson. And it rolled over into the Trudeau era, the Pierre Elliott Trudeau era. Its results were published in 1967 to 1970, maybe 1971. I think I have that date for the publication of Volume 4. It was undertaken by these handsome gentlemen dressed in sort of classic mid-century attire, looking very serious and studious and official. The man just left of center is the one that we will be interested in. That is Yaroslav Rudnitsky. This handsome guy here, again, in sort of resplendent in official business attire of the mid-century. Just a few facts about his life. I think a lot of people here will recognize the name, certainly. He's born in the early 20th century in Halicina, which was at the time under the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He gets his doctorate in Europe in 1937 in the field of Slavistics, which I think it makes sense given that he winds up in the Department of Slavic Studies at the University of Manitoba once he emigrates to Canada. He has a pretty long career there. I haven't written down the dates. I believe he starts teaching in the early 1950s. But by 1963, he is suggested by the UCC, of all people, to the federal, so the federal Liberals as an addition to the B&B Commission. So he goes to Ottawa, and he is instrumental in writing, especially much of the material that focuses on non-Ukrainians, on non-English and non-French minorities in the country. He mentions, for instance, this third force that comes into play. We will talk about the other person who is instrumental in creating the third force idea in a second. But this appears in print in this document. It becomes a resource that others can draw on in generating a broader multicultural conception out of this bilingual and bicultural idea that this report starts off with. The question of, can the aspirations of those of Chinese origin in Vancouver be amalgamated with the aspirations of those of Ukrainian origin in Winnipeg? This is really like a central question of many of the folks working in second language education over the next 20 years. Lupul talks about this a ton in his memoir. And really, this stuff is being discussed at these very high levels in the early to mid 1960s in Ottawa. So the other person to talk about in this connection is a guy named Paul Yuzik. Often wondered if it's Yuzik, given my name is Pijik and I go by Pizik. He's born in Pinto, Saskatchewan in 1913. So he's different than Rudnitsky in the sense that he is born of immigrant parents who are already in Canada. This would put him in the so-called first wave of diaspora Ukrainians. He also is teaching at the University of Manitoba, this like hotspot, this sort of incubator of thinkers around multiculturalism at this time. He's appointed to the Senate by Diefenbaker in 1963, which puts him on the other side of the aisle. There's this interesting way in which this highlights the fact that multiculturalism is a product as much of progressive conservatives as of liberals at this time. It forms part of the interesting tension by which this kind of works out over the next 40 years until it kind of, for 20 to 30 years, until it kind of collapses in the 90s and progressive conservatives decide that they don't want to do multiculturalism anymore. The third element, which becomes the third force, appears as early as 1963 in a speech that he makes to the Senate. Canada, a multicultural nation. And, you can access, this speech was reprinted relatively early, I think in a journal of Slavonic studies in North America. I forget exactly which one. If someone wants to point this out, that would be really helpful. But this forms some of the resources that that not Yuzik necessarily is drawing, because he's the one creating the resources, but that Rudnitsky is drawing on, that others are drawing on. So this invites us to really ask, okay, so we talked about structures and schemas, and what are the structures that we're kind of dealing with here? I would say that bilingualism broadly is a structural constraint, or maybe it enables certain kinds of people in the country. Interestingly, bilingualism, biculturalism, these are structures that would be kind of put aside in favor of multiculturalism for a little while. Once the Canadian Constitution of 1982 was published, those resources really only protected by bilingualism and biculturalism, and there's a really different dynamic that happens then, which invites some thinking about how these things work. The third force is an idea, is this a schema? I've just described it as a resource. This is maybe something that, if people are interested in asking questions, we can discuss or sort of debate. Electoral politics as a system, as a schema within which all of these people are working, right? Rudnitsky is being selected by duly appointed officials within the Canadian government. ULEC is being appointed by different officials, but within the same system. Public education is something that is talked about, but not worked with directly in this case. Then the resources. I mean, the biggest resource often is literal money. I think we will mention this in each of the case studies that we'll be talking about. Political influence, networks of influence, electoral support. Electoral support is often conditioned on demographic trends. Demography a structure? Could be, but it's also a resource in this case. I'm going to pause there before moving on because we just sort of tackled something very big at the national level. If there are thoughts or questions, we can hold off to the end or we can talk about them now. I'm going to move on to case study 2, which is CIUS and ULEC. We've already kind of noted that the early history of ULEC is really the history of the Ukrainian Language Resource Centre. But there's sort of an earlier history than that, which I talk about in the early chapters of my history, which is the early history of the Ukrainian Bilingual Program. I focus in particular on Alberta, bilingual education in Alberta. I think, interviewees, for example, that I've talked to have rightly criticized this to some extent. It's where CIUS is, it's where ULEC is, it's where a lot of the action is happening around the history that I wrote specifically. So it was kind of unavoidable. 1976, CIUS is formed, and then 1986, the Ukrainian Language Education Centre is formed. So this is like a super, super basic timeline that I'm working with here. I think it's an open question. Some people might not be aware of it these days, why ULEC formed, when it did, how it formed. And to get into this, we really do have to talk about provincial politics. We might even have to talk about international politics, the economy, the oil economy at that time. So we are in the Getty years. Here's Don Getty again. I will also mention that these days, Getty means very different things for me. So it kind of is fun to play with the fact that I sometimes have to think about Don Getty in addition to the various Gettys that are implicated in my institution. But during these years, oil prices have crashed. There are many factors. One is a war between Iraq and Iran, where they flood the market with oil. It really takes a few years to really proliferate through the economy, really drive down oil to the point where it affects Alberta's economy, or I suppose its provincial budget. But once it does, the budget winds up under real pressure. I think, in ways that are kind of hard to imagine now. This leads to really radical budget cuts across the provincial government. Maybe we can imagine all sorts of negative scenarios, budget scenarios in Alberta these days as well. Nevertheless, one of the pivots that happens at this time is that the provincial government decides that they're going to pivot away from all sorts of responsibilities, including directly funding or directly running various aspects of the education programs that they previously had either been funding directly or running. So this in some ways is an opportunity for an organization like CIUS or what would be ULEC, because in 1986, the Advanced Education Endowment and Incentive Fund is created, which promises for a very short window funds for any kind of endowment that is created for institutions that are going to function in the higher education space. ULEC is conceived in the mind of several individuals. I would point especially to folks at the so-called P's and B's. This is the Ukrainian Professional and Business Club of Edmonton, which is a major diasporic I guess a voluntary association of the pre and post-war era, but especially in this time, there is a huge overlap between their activities and bilingual education in the province. So in the 70s, they have a textbook fund, which is doing a lot of funding of resource creation, the printing of resources, and the distribution of resources within the province. Standards that my generation used in either elementary school or in Saturday school, like Tutti Pam and the whole series of resources associated with it, were created in this era and are a product of this initiative. Individuals at the P&Bs at this time took a look at this 2-to-1 matching fund opportunity and basically decided to divert that funding toward a larger initiative that could intensify their impact. So I'm gonna, just to make sure I get the details correct, I'm gonna quote from my own history. Thus, the joint UCC CIUS APUE letter. APUE is Alberta.
Parents for Ukrainian Education.
Yes, thank you so much. Propose that the UCEBF, that is the P's and B's, take $200,000 from its textbook fund, donate to CIUS, apply the provincial funding, and grow it to a $600,000 fund to support Ukrainian language education. The question was, however, what form should this take? The joint letter to first Lupul from a series of kind of civic leaders within the Ukrainian community, was accompanied by a 7-page proposal for the Ukrainian Language Education Centre. The proposal was attributed to the same 3 individuals who sent the letter, which is listed here, written primarily by CIUS Director Volodymyr Kravchenko. They described a center that would operate within CIUS and would undertake the substantive work of supporting language education, the importance of which they covered in a preamble. I'm going to stop quoting only because we are running out of time, but here too, we're left with the question of there are structures at play and there are schemas and resources. And this resulted in the foundation of ULEC, which started the next year. Marusia Petrishyn was its first director. And there are schemas at play. Again, public education. In this case, voluntary associations, the P's and B's, APUE, the diaspora community in Edmonton. So this is actually adjacent to but separate from voluntary associations. Endowment funding and higher education in general. And then the resources are something like money, network connections, grant writing, experience, and knowledge. These are all resources that are marshaled in order to work within these schemas. All right, let's do case study 3. And then we've got about 10 minutes, so I will try to keep this quick, but I don't want to shortchange anyone. This is to say technology and ULEC. And I would say that ULEC is it's a major contributor to the use of technology in education, starting in the late 90s and 2000s. So having said that, I want to point to, the first coordinator for the ULRC, that is our own Olenka Bilash. She was an early pioneer in pushing video education, VHS tapes, as a technological and educational resource in the late 70s and early 80s. We see the titular Romko robot amidst a group of Ukrainian children in a series of educational videos that were produced basically in-house at the University of Alberta that were then distributed as an educational resource, in a technology that today looks very humble and very common, but at the time was expensive, sophisticated, cutting edge. VHS, who would have thought, except, I think the people who lived through it will remember this. I think these tapes were going for hundreds of dollars in terms of cost. and distribution. Nevertheless, the reason was because they provided a real educational opportunity to reach more people. The same goes for the internet of the 2000s. Something that I think we remember as sort of laughable today, text HTML pages with very small, low-res images. But, this page, which is dated to 1999 for the University of Alberta, is something that at the time was the state of the art. This was how people communicated on the internet. And ULEC was a mover and a shaker in this space. They provided a resource called Room, which was a sort of portal that gathered educational resources together. Now, here I'm using educational resources in the pedagogical sense. They were also resources in Sewell's sense as well. This was financed and organized through an organization called UKIPCA, which worked with the government of Alberta and functioned as a consortium through which these kinds of initiatives were undertaken. I think several people in the room will have been involved with this. And so we can point to several. I mean, Marussia, Roman, you were among the people involved. If anyone in the audience is here, I can't see everyone. So if someone else is here, please give yourself a shout out. Feel free to interrupt me when you do so. This is a long-term effort that ULEC undertook to use digital technology to enhance its capacities. There obviously is risk and reward with this, which we'll talk about, but the team is substantially in 1996 that we see here, which is from left to right: Oksana Popovich, Miroslava Fodchuk, Marussia Petrishin, Mark Malowany, I'm not sure how he pronounces it, Halyat Tsar. These were the folks who were working on this at the time, and were really pioneering something quite new in the late 90s and early 2000s. And it creates, even though some of this becomes non-active or falls into disrepair later, it results in future ULEC initiatives like Podoroji, Budimo, which are also educational resources that leverage the internet to do the things that would have been impossible in a print-only environment. Obviously, there are risks and rewards associated with this. All of these are sort of expensive in their own ways. They relied on government funding, which could be fickle, but these are things that I think folks were aware of at the time. Actually, I'll mention one other person here, which was Kim Robinson, who later becomes Kim Brokoff. She was a project manager working with ULEC at the time, who really helped to get these initiatives off the ground. So I don't want to leave her unheralded as well. Okay, so here again, we're left with structures that have schemas. We have to talk about, and this is relevant in that environment in the mid-90s, waning multicultural buy-in. In 1996, the Multiculturalism Act in Alberta is withdrawn. There is less support for it. This goes along with a libertarian politics that Ralph Klein would have been emblematic of at the time. Public education and the overlap with third-party solutions kind of ties into this. This is something that ULEC specialized in at the time, offering services, creating resources, filling gaps that the province no longer wanted to sort of, in responsibilities that the province no longer wanted to take upon itself. Changing technology. Technology, I think, is a structure. It is an ever-changing structure, but if you doubt the ways in which it structures our lives, just look at how we're talking to one another right now, and then think about the ways in which it's impacted the economy and politics of our own time, especially in the last 5 years after COVID. Resources, ever present, is money, political networks. There's the equipment required to do digital publication at the time, and there's the expertise. So I'll sort of leave it there, but we'll move on, and any questions about this can be brought up in the question period afterwards. And I'm going to conclude, actually. I think we're sort of at the end of where we were. I think people might want to ask themselves whether this is useful to them in their real life. The fact is, I'm always thinking about Sewell. I'm always thinking about what structures am I working with with? What structures am I writing about? What are the schemas that are at play? What are the resources that the people involved in these things are marshaling or failing to marshal? There's such thing as failing to act using the resources that you have. There are people who fail to capitalize on their resources. I think that there are people who would criticize this for, if anything, explaining too much, explaining so much that it's not even useful for our purposes. And I leave that to you to judge whether you think that this is a realistic or worthwhile lens to apply to history. You may not, and that's okay. I think that it's something that I often apply in concert with other kinds of theories, either of history or of science or of politics, when I write. So I'm going to leave it there, and I will end on this note. Again, did I mess anything up? Any corrections? Please let me know at the following email. Either, take a photo, or I will return to this upon request. But on that note, I will end. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mark, for such an engaging presentation. And I guess we now have a bit of time for any questions. So does anyone have any questions?
I certainly have the first question, if I may.
Please.
Mark, I wonder if you would comment about...
Sorry, Mark, would you just close there? Thanks. Sorry.
I wonder if you'd comment a little bit about the persistence of some schemas and resources as opposed to others. For example, literal, in the three cases you've given, you've talked about literal money, and then in this third case, you've also talked about money. So it strikes me that money is, the schema of money and the resource of money are key to the sustainability, and that those factors are perhaps more important in sustainability than others. How would you comment about the categories that you've been used? For example, even the word multiculturalism itself, it persists to this day, but it has a completely different meaning. It seems less impactful today than, for example, money. Money continues to have impact on the ability of ULEC to function.
I mean, this is great in part because it both, I think it presses on this as an explanatory factor. I mean, there's the idea that maybe it just covers too much. But, we could talk about the fact that, money has always been something that humans have used. But then let's kind of zoom in on different stages. I mean, we're currently in a stage where paper money, the penny just stopped being pressed in the United States. So money is changing in different ways. Nevertheless, money as this kind of unit of exchange, as something that we use, is obviously still important. And, obviously, I think the administrator who fails to account for funding or for persistent funding is doomed to failure. So I think that maybe there is this kind of hierarchy that we can set up. But as you say, the change in multiculturalism is really notable. And this is the way in which, there's internal logics to structure that change over time because of the ways that they butt up against other structures. So politics obviously affected this tremendously. There was a kind of reaction to multiculturalism in the 90s that started with various, what are we going to call them, like alliances of different political actors deciding that they didn't want to do this anymore, right? So like Klein and the PCs are a good example. And yeah, rather than outright say that they were not doing multiculturalism anymore. They shifted the terms of debate in a way that I think was effective. They shifted it to sort of racial and religious grounds that, I think that none of us would argue that, there needed to be improvement in how racial minorities, religious minorities were treated in Canada, moving out of the 1980s into the 1990s. Indigenous Canadians and so forth, but it does shift the ground under the multicultural consensus that existed in the 70s and 80s away from language, away from cultural issues that really privileged groups like Ukrainians specifically. And that formed the basis for a certain kind of politics that included, really high-powered Alberta politicians in the 70s, the Bert Hohls, the Julian Koziaks of the world. And so the way that shook out, covered in detail in my history, and I won't go into more detail here, but I will just say that that proved to be a more passing and a more surface structure for which to base a politics, right? Multicultural politics of the 70s and 80s just wasn't going to continue on that basis. I mentioned the fact that it was very weakly protected in the 1982 Constitution versus biculturalism and bilingualism. That also shifted the ground underneath those participating in this kind of politics. So, when Lupul talks about the politics of multiculturalism, he mentions all these things. He's also talking about the structures of multiculturalism. I'm putting the emphasis on a slightly different place.
Thank you, Mark. Does anyone else have any questions? No questions. Okay, good. Then thank you, Mark, again. And please, our dear participants, you can see the feedback form. The link is in the chat. I will also share the screen so you can use the QR code if you want. Please leave your feedback or maybe any questions. We can pass it on to Mark and he may maybe answer it later.
Yeah.
Yeah, and thank you. And we also invite
Actually, could I just say one more thing?
Sure.
This actually just sort of unlocked for me another association, right? This idea of technology, the shifting educational landscape, right? For ULEC, this is relevant because there is sort of there's not entirely a move away from elementary or high school education, the UBP in general, but there is a move into university level courses. And, that is something else that's shifting under the ground of the various social actors involved. It means that, for example, someone like Alla Nadashkivska becomes particularly important in the post-2013 moment where there's an opportunity to leverage technology and also university-level teaching to sort of navigate some of the choppy waters that ULEC faced in that time. So that also strikes me as another way in which structures are changing. There are through lines, but then it's the business of effective social agents, social entrepreneurs to find their footing and to sort of find a way to move through those, or to even and I would say that or even to affect structures. But that one is a really tough order. Individuals influencing structures is, I don't know if this is a good example or a good analogy or not. In the book, I use the analogy of trying to steer a battleship with a canoe paddle. And, I think it is about on the right scale. You'd have to have really strong arms.
Mark, I'm also wondering if structures can be restructured. So what I have in mind here is I was going to ask you about concepts of structures, thinking about multiculturalism and what it meant in, pre-1971, 1971, the 1980s, and today. And in one way, you could argue that it became a concept that is now taken for granted. If you talk to immigrants who who come from many different countries, they will always say, "Oh, Canada is multicultural. They don't have to even be here." On the other hand, the way it's enacted, the way it's supported, funded, is very different from its birth, let's say, to now. So I'm thinking about that as once a very strong structure, a pillar that we really relied upon, to now it's almost like we need new pillars. We need, new, maybe I should say, arguments to make money.
Yeah, I definitely couldn't agree more. So I'm just going to briefly share my screen again and just, tap the sign and remind people that this is what we're talking about, right? Everybody can see this. Okay. This is, we're talking about the transposability of schemas. You're taking rules and habits and ways of talking about things that have developed in one place, and they're moving to other places, to other groups, to other parts of the community. They're being taken up and modified or used in just slightly different ways. Then we're talking about the unpredictability of resource accumulation, the ways in which resources are accumulated in one place. I would say that Ukrainians in Canada really capitalized on the multicultural moment in the 70s and 80s. That the ground shifts, and again, if you have oil in 1870, whatever, if you have it in 1970, that's a big deal. And there are other groups that come to benefit from these resources in the 90s and 2000s. But one of the reasons why this shift has happened in the first place is because the PCs don't want to really fund these things as much anymore anyway. So at the same time, a lot of the resources like money are being clawed back and put into other places in the budget. And then there's the polysemy of resources, right? Where these resources, something like the word multiculturalism, has many meanings. It can shift over time, or it can mean different things to different people at the same time. So that's kind of where that's really me restating what we've already said, but I hope profitably.
Does somebody have more questions, or?
I think we have some comments. I don't know. Do you mind if I read these?
Yes, of course.
So Uliana says, having had the privilege of serving for a time as editor-in-chief of Umrum, very cool, I could safely say that it is an interactive resource that is missed. Organizations and institutions in Ukraine continue to try to create portals of this ilk. As the demand is ever on the increase, I see this as a sign of the breadth of the Ukrainian community, its growing transnational nature, in part due to politically caused migration patterns. Perhaps the conditions of invasion and war since 2014, and especially 2022, have impacted how multiculturalism is understood, appreciated, and acted upon in Canada today. This has created new possibilities for ULEC. Thanks. I think that's well taken. And then Marussia has a comment as well. The framework you adopted is an elegant tool for organizing history. Thank you. Appreciate it. Although maybe William Sewell is the person you're really complimenting. It is also a very useful tool for analysis and also for future planning. ULEC's plan in its plan in its creation was a cooperative project with CIUS director Bogdan. Oh God, geez. Yes, Bogdan Kravchenko, not. In terms of resources, Alberta had the following to support education learning resource center. Full stop. Learning Resource Centre and a provincial TV channel. These were closed, and that affected the work of ULEC. Thank you. Can't wait for the book. Neither can I, actually.
Well, Mark, I'm sure we could go on and on. I certainly would love to because I love the fact that we've got a theoretical component, and part of ULEC's goal is that we don't just report events, but we bring them to the level of analysis and interpretation, and that's the role of theory. You've done such a great job, and I'm going to ask Oksana to express our gratitude.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Thank you on behalf of the ULEC team. Thank you for this insightful and thoughtfully structured, well-structured presentation. Your analysis of the context of the ULEC Foundation and functioning and development is very, very valuable, and it gives us more inspiration for the future work. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for your time and attention. It's always a pleasure to talk about these things. I hope to see everybody in a Zoom room at some point talking about more of this sort of subject matter in the future. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everyone. Please, if you are not on our email address list, please put your email in the chat. And as you know, we have some up and coming webinars. Maria, do you have that information? Yes, thank you. Next week, we have Nadia Prokopchuk, March 10th, who's going to talk about Ukraine's global migration, the effect on Ukrainian bilingual education in Western Canada. And at the end of the month, we have Larissa Hajduk, who will talk about Beyond Intercultural Competence, a personal journey toward cultural safety in short-term global learning. And so she's going to talk about the impact that visiting Ukraine had on students before the war, or the invasion, and on Canadian students. So I think it'll be very interesting. Thank you again, and hope to see you in the near future.
Bye-bye.
Everyone.